and this is Justice Pending. Before we get started, I'm excited to share something new. I'm launching a monthly, in-person, live on the road Texas Justice Tour featuring Justice Pending, where I'll take you deeper into the cases that keep me up at night, including missing persons, unsolved murders, and cold cases still waiting for answers. Each month, I'll be joined by a co-host. Check out show dates and locations in the link in the description, and I hope to see you at the show.
This is a Rogue Media Network podcast.
Do you ever have a story that you just can't get out of your head?
One that you play the details of over and over with your friends?
Well, you've come to the right place. I'm Claire.
And I'm Susan.
And this is Justice Pending,
a weekly true crime podcast where we discuss tantalizing crimes with more questions than answers.
Hey, and welcome back to another episode of Justice Pending. I'm joined today by a special guest. Tanita Matthews is a journalist joining us from the south coast of England today. Tanita, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Claire. It's great to be with you.
So today we're going to be talking about a very fascinating unsolved case that I had never heard of, which happens somewhat infrequently. So I'm excited to hear about this case and to have Tanita take us through, because this is one that she has researched and worked on for a long time, and she's really quite the authority on this case. She wrote a book. It's called The Murder of Judith Roberts, with her co-author here, Chris Clark. And so let's get into it. Tell me, who was Judith Roberts?
Judith Roberts was a 14-year-old girl. She lived in Tamworth in Staffordshire, which is kind of the West Midlands area of the UK. Judith was a sister. She was also a twin. She was a daughter. She was a young girl who was quite shy, kept herself to herself, but, had school friends and had hobbies and interests. She loved the bike that she had at her home. It was a Christmas gift from her parents. She was just your quintessential young British schoolgirl.
And tell me, paint a picture for me. When does she go missing? What time are we talking about in history here, and what are the circumstances of her disappearance?
So this all happens in 1972. So we're talking over 50 years now. But in the summer of 1972, Judith goes missing. And what precludes that is that she comes home from school one day, very normal day for her. She had her set routine. She would come home. She would eat her dinner, eat her tea with her family, and then she would do schoolwork, and then she may go and take a cycle around the block on her bike, or she may spend time with her family. And on this particular day, there was nothing different about that. She did come home from school and sat with her family, and there seemed to have been some crosswords exchanged at tea time, because Judith was picking at her food and her parents scolded her a little bit for it. I think we've all been there.
Sure.
And so Judith is told to leave the dinner table, which she does. She goes out to her garden and she picks up her bike and she goes for a cycle. It is the height of summer in 1972, so it's still light outside when she goes out. But around 10 o'clock, her parents come to realize that she hasn't returned home. Her sisters haven't seen her. Her twin hasn't seen her. And everybody's very worried about her, because it was not like Judith to stay out past curfew. It was not like her to be out and not tell anybody. And so the police are called, and they arrive at the family home, and this search for Judith begins. Now, Judith is missing for 3 days, and on the third day, she is very unfortunately and very tragically found in a field only a mile from her home. This field could be seen from her own bedroom window.
Oh,
That's how
wow.
that's how close she was to home. And she is found deceased in a field along with her bike. She is discovered underneath, in a kind of crude grave, I would call it, because somebody has very clearly tried to disguise her body. There are grass clippings on top of her. There is a sheet of corrugated asbestos. There are fertilizer sacks placed on top of her to try and hide the body. And she is found by police and soldiers who are out looking for her, have been looking for her for the past 72 hours. And she is found deceased. And so this investigation springs to life, because this is just not the kind of thing that happens in this area. It's not the kind of thing that happens to a young schoolgirl. And it's really shocking to this community. I mean, to give you some background as well, the kind of locale to where Judith was living just a few years prior had gone through an enormous investigation and a very difficult time, where some young school children had been abducted, had been found murdered, and there was a whole trial around that had only concluded a few years prior to this happening. So the community had only really started to heal and started to, move through that grief on that. And that was still really shocking back then. The circumstances of that particular crime were incredibly distressing. And so I feel like for the community, this then particular attack on Judith just kind of brought all that to the surface again. And it was particularly upsetting because she's just so young. She had her life brutally ended. And she's got a family who are just missing her and grieving for her incredibly.
Yeah, it really sounds like every parent's worst nightmare. Just an average, seemingly normal day that turns tragic in the worst possible way. And yeah, I can only imagine what that family must have been going through. And were they considered suspects? Were they looking at people close to Judith as potentially responsible for this, or was it always, thought to be someone outside her known contacts?
Well, so the family weren't suspects because her mum and dad, as I understand it, had gone out for the evening. Her dad was a local headmaster at the school that she went to. Her family were very well respected in the area. So I don't think that for 1 minute anybody thought that the family were involved. And I mean, Judith was such a shy young woman that it really opened up that question of, well, who could this be?
Yeah.
Who has brutally attacked this young woman in such a ferocious way? Because I should add as well that the injuries on Judith were just, to call them brutal would be a complete understatement. This was not somebody who had, kind of a one-punch incident, as we see those happen in the world, but this was someone who had forcefully, brutally, and really very violently attacked a young child. So the police were looking for who could be responsible. And I guess given the nature of what happened prior, they were aware that there are very unsavory people out in the community who commit crimes like this against young children. And I think that's what the police were trying to navigate, was who could have done this to Judith? Who is responsible? Who has this kind of violent tendency towards a young child?
Yeah, and so how did they start bringing in suspects? Were they looking at people who had criminal records, had been recently released from prison? How did they go about, creating a suspect profile here?
I feel like the police very quickly tried to figure out who was responsible. I mean, other than the fact that this is a young child and that makes it just all the more tragic, but police really were looking at, as you say, violent offenders, people in the area. They had a number of local residents who had seen Judith in the hours prior to her being killed and prior to when they believe she'd been killed. She'd been spotted on her bike cycling around the vicinity of the area. Some witnesses had reported seeing a particular type of car, so police were starting to look into that. But with a car, the list is kind of endless. Even in the 70s, who owned this particular type of car? Well, that could be anybody. So the police really were focusing all their attention on trying to build a profile as to who could have committed this, but they were kind of coming up short. There wasn't anything that was jumping out to them. There wasn't anybody in particular who would have wanted to harm Judith. I mean, she didn't have any enemies. She's a small child. She hadn't forged her way in the world that would bring in suspects like that. But yeah, the police were coming up quite short, and I think that is why what happens next becomes all the more shocking.
Yes. So tell me about what was considered a big break in the case at the time.
A young man walks into the police station and he tells them, "I think I had something to do with Judith Roberts' murder." Now, for the police, that is quite an unusual and alarming statement. They've been searching for this person. It's really high on their list of priorities, and somebody walks in and goes, "Hey, I think I had something to do with this." This young man, he's 17 years old. His name is Andrew Evans. He is a local squaddie. He has been living at the local barracks for the last while, and he has just been kind of let go, as you were, from these particular barracks due to health issues. But he tells the police, "I keep having these dreams. I keep seeing her face, and it makes me think that maybe I had something to do with it." Police
That's
protocol.
stunning right there. Just
No.
the idea that someone would walk in and give them this lead that seemingly comes from nowhere. He was not on anyone's radar. He didn't have a criminal record. He wasn't seen in the area at the time that she had disappeared. So any investigator would be very interested in speaking with Andrew Evans.
Right. And I think police protocols, obviously in 1972, are not the well-developed protocols that we have now in modern policing. So you have to try and look at it with a little pinch of salt, but at the same time, there's clearly some mistakes that happen in this investigation. I don't think that's unfair to say, but Andrew Evans is interviewed at length without an appropriate adult present. He is interrogated over this incident, and he's getting himself more and more worked up and more convinced that because he's seen Judith's face in a dream, he must have had something to do with it. And after hours and hours of interrogation, effectively signs a confession that says he killed Judith.
Incredible. Just to go from no suspects, no leads, and to have someone walk in and say the things that he said, even without any physical evidence, and then he would sign a confession. I mean, gosh, it's that's like a quite the twist for a day in the police station.
Right?
So, was it smooth sailing after that, Tanita? Since he signed the confession, it should just be a couple matters of paperwork before he goes away forever, right?
Well, yes, you would think so, wouldn't you? But it turns out that Andrew Evans signing this confession, and it's something that has been studied a lot in false confessions by scientists and psychologists, but Andrew Evans effectively thinks, somewhat naively, that with the rate at which the police are interrogating him, if he signs the confession, he can just go home and they can deal with it later, and he can truly think about this from that point. But what has happened is he's signed it. The police have gone, "We've got our guy. We don't need to keep looking. Someone's walked in and told us they've done it." And so from Andrew Evans' point of view, he is thinking, right, I'm going to be able to go home and sort all this out, speak to my appropriate adult, and the police book him and charge him with the murder, and he is going to trial for this murder.
Yeah, that's incredible. He could not have been more wrong about what was going to happen next, but you're right. This is somewhat common with false confessions where they feel like it's their only escape. Their only out is just to admit to something that they didn't actually do just to make the interrogation stop.
Yes. Yes. And so Andrew Evans goes to court. There is, the investigation is over. He's going to court, and he is from effectively there on in trying to convince the police that he didn't do it. There's a couple of other things in that mix that come out in court. So one of the police officers talks about, well, he knew where the body was. They took him to the field and had him point out where he had supposedly disposed of Judith's body. And he pointed to the right place. So, I mean, that's pretty compelling evidence from a police officer's point of view. However, what wasn't disclosed, which I found quite shocking when researching for the book, is that in the newspapers, there were literal maps drawn of where Judith was disposed. There are, maps of the field and an X to say, this is where the body was found. So when the police are saying, well, he knew where the body was, nobody other than the killer could have known that. It was in the newspapers. And so Andrew Evans could have very well seen those. They were local newspapers. He could have very well seen that. And that could be the reason why he knew what he knew. And the more this process is going on, the more he's realizing, hang on, maybe I didn't have something to do with this. Maybe this isn't right. And he pleads not guilty when he goes into court, but there is a trial. And ultimately the jury believe that he is responsible, and they do convict him, which I can only imagine from Andrew Evans' point of view, that you keep trying to prove that you didn't do this particular thing, and suddenly you are stood in court and the jury come back and say, we find you guilty, and you know that you're in serious trouble from here on in. And they convict him, and he is sentenced to life, effectively. He's detained at Her Majesty's pleasure.
Yeah, it's unbelievable how bad this went and how quickly for Andrew Evans. One of the things that really stood out to me when I was reading your book, and I enjoyed it so much, was the fact that there was no physical evidence against Andrew Evans. There were no bloody clothes. There were no fingerprints. There was nothing that tied him to the scene of the crime. And you talked about it being especially brutal. It was, she was struck something by hammer, a blunt instrument, and the idea that he would go back to the army barracks, right? The military barracks, where people know all your business. There's not private suites. You don't do your own laundry, right? So where are these bloody clothes, Tanita? How does that get explained?
I don't know that it ever does get explained. And one of the things we did for the book, which I thought was particularly important to do, was we had a look at the injuries. We consulted with an independent pathologist, because the pathologist who conducted the autopsy has long since passed. So we couldn't speak with him, because I wanted to find out more about, well, why did you say this? Why was this particular thing not looked at more? And there were some of those in his report. And the pathologist who Chris and I spoke to said, yes, you would expect someone who had committed that crime to walk away with bloody clothes and to have some evidence on them that they were the one to commit this crime. But no, that was never explained at trial, as to how there was no physical evidence that, other than Andrew Evans saying he did it, which, to give the police some dues, that's quite compelling evidence.
It is.
But to back it up, there is no physical evidence that places Andrew Evans there. So, then to give Andrew Evans the benefit of the doubt, actually, that should have been a real slam dunk, in that there was nothing actually physically tying him to the crime.
Yeah, I think that cannot be understated, that this was a very violent crime. It's not as though shot with a single bullet and, there wouldn't necessarily be evidence. There were lots of evidence somewhere, but not with Andrew Evans. So what happens to get you involved in the investigation into the murder of Judith Roberts?
Well, it was one of those things that was just being, in a certain place at a certain time. it was actually Chris Clark who approached me. Now, Chris, who unfortunately can't be with us, Chris is a retired Norfolk detective. He served in Norfolk Constabulary, and he has, in his retirement, done a lot of work looking into Peter Sutcliffe. He wrote a fantastic book with another British author called Tim Tate called Peter Sutcliffe, The Secret Murders, which came out, must be 20, I want to say 2017, but I don't even know that I'm correct, but quite a while ago. And Chris and Tim looked at a multitude of potential victims who were attacked by Peter Sutcliffe. And Chris wanted to look at it more, and he wanted to look at some of the different cases more. And he approached me knowing about my background, knowing about my kind of interests in writing and crime reporting, and said, "Hey, I want to do this. Would you be interested?" Chris and I had been friends for a long time at that point, and I said, "Yes, absolutely. I want to do this. Let's do it." And that is kind of how I came into it. Now, that was in 2019. And around the same time, Chris's book with Tim Tate was being made into a documentary with a production company. And as it so happens, because of the timing of this all, I wound up working on the documentary as well, because I was considered to have a particular type of knowledge around the case. So that is kind of how I came into it, and where that story begins.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I always enjoy whenever worlds collide and you get new opportunities. So when does his conviction fall apart? Because despite the problems, he is convicted, he is found guilty, he is serving time for the murder of Judith Roberts. It's solved at one point, right? When does it become unsolved again?
It takes about 25 years for everything to be turned on its head. It takes 25 years of Andrew Evans fighting for his freedom, fighting to have his name cleared, have his conviction overturned, and there are various people who come to his aid and help with raising his profile and getting it before the Court of Appeal in London. But I don't know that then Judith's story doesn't get solved. That's the really sad thing, is
Yeah.
that after somebody has been to prison for 25 years, so what's that, a quarter of a decade? At the time, it was Britain's longest miscarriage of justice in history. So that was quite substantial. But Andrew Evans, 25 years later, does have his conviction overturned based on the fact that there is no physical evidence tying him, and the fact that he is saying he didn't do it. And he is released from prison after 25 years. And Judith's story kind of stopped, from what I could see. I don't know whether the police considered that they'd done their due diligence, they had found their suspect.
Yeah.
I don't really know what happened there, but actually, yeah, Judith's story just kind of comes to a bit of a halt, and she almost gets forgotten in all of this, which I found incredibly sad.
Definitely. I can think of cases where the suspect is acquitted, and the law enforcement, in the United States, they feel like they know that that person did it. It just wasn't proven in court, and they don't go and find other suspects. The case just sits on the shelf. I have several of those in my own experience, one in Texas and one in Missouri, where I'm just stunned that, this person was acquitted, and according to the police, well, we had the right person, we just couldn't prove it. And so we're not, unless someone walks in and brings us DNA evidence against someone else, we're not doing anything else with this case. And it sounds to me like it wasn't necessarily that police felt beyond a shadow of a doubt that it had to be Andrew Evans. It was just that they had nowhere else to go with a case this old, with no physical items that they could test, nothing to put into, the latest and greatest DNA technology machine.
Yeah.
So, how does Peter Sutcliffe get introduced into this investigation? And who is Peter Sutcliffe? Because he is not someone that was familiar to me as an American, and I'm sure many people in my audience may have never heard of this serial killer.
Well, for a start, you're absolutely right. When Andrew Evans comes out, there is no evidence to be tested. Police had actually rounded up 11,000 sets of fingerprints during their investigation, and after Andrew Evans was convicted, they were all thrown away,
Oh my
which
gosh.
they have to do because, legally the case is closed. They can't hold on to that.
Right.
But
And just the logistics of it, right? They're trying to clear their files, but oh gosh, it's terrible to think it was all lost.
yeah, so they, in terms of the DNA evidence, what's left? I don't know that there is much left or anything that could, as you say, go through some kind of newfound science or tests that would bring them new evidence, and that is in itself is really sad. So Peter Sutcliffe is a well-known serial killer in the United Kingdom. He was active between 1975 and was eventually caught in 1981. And for those years, he flew under the radar. Nobody knew who he was, but he was conducting what can only be described as a reign of terror amongst men, women, parents, children in the north of England between those years. Women were being attacked, brutally attacked, by this unknown suspect. They were being murdered. Their bodies were being discarded in awful places. And then there were women who were being attacked and had survived, but they had gone through incredible trauma given what they'd experienced. And police in West Yorkshire, where most of this was taking place, were frantically trying to solve this case. They were trying to solve who was responsible for these murders that were happening. And when Peter Sutcliffe is arrested in 1981, he goes to trial. He is convicted of 13 murders and 7 attempted murders.
Wow. That is a very busy guy.
Yeah. And he is convicted. He is sentenced to many lives in prison.
As he should be, yes.
Yeah, 100%. And that story is really interesting for many, many reasons, because it's only once he's caught that police start to be able to pull other things together. There are independent inquiries that happen to look into, well, why wasn't he caught for so long? What happened? Which other cases could potentially be linked? How do we avoid something like this happening in the future? A little kind of side story is that at one point the police receive a tape and a man with a Geordie accent claiming to be the man responsible for these attacks, and it sends the lead detective off on a tangent thinking that he's hunting down this vicious killer, and it winds up being a hoax.
Oh my goodness. That's terrible.
Incredibly so. And it takes them a long time to establish that the person on these tapes is not the person they're looking for. Even the victims themselves were saying, the person who spoke to me before he attacked me didn't have a Geordie accent, so I don't think it's them. And these women weren't being believed. At the same time, while this is all happening, the reporting on these attacks is just terrible, to say the least. I mean, the language that is used to report on these crimes we would call it victim blaming today.
Yeah.
Exactly what it is. These women were called, they were basically called prostitutes. They were called good time girls, women who effectively had brought this on themselves. And that is just awful. And it takes a long time for that narrative to be undone. And I still think we understand it a lot more now, but it is such a damaging narrative that it prevents women from coming forward who've been attacked, because they themselves may not be sex workers. Some of the victims were sex workers, definitely not all of them, but these were women who effectively were in dire circumstances or in difficult circumstances, who were trying to make money, sometimes to keep their families afloat. And sometimes these were women who were just out in the wrong place at the wrong time and were attacked. And so there were a lot of mistakes with this investigation into Peter Sutcliffe. And as I say, 2 independent reports concluded that there were a multitude of mistakes that they should avoid in the future, because they never wanted to have something like this happen again. But it is a case that still has a lot of scars for many people in the United Kingdom. Almost everyone you speak to, over the age of, I don't want to say, 50, has some recollection of being told to stay indoors. Don't go out at night. Don't make yourself vulnerable. There being marches about, well, why should women be the ones to stay indoors? Why should we be the ones to, to take action? The police should be taking action and keeping us safe. So there is a lot of fascination around Peter Sutcliffe. But what I find fascinating, truly, are the women who are affected and how their story is shaped by what happened to them. And that is hugely tragic.
It is. It is. I was so stunned to hear how many similarities there were between other known crimes of Peter Sutcliffe and the murder of Judith Roberts. Although you can say there's some things that are outliers, why don't you talk about the connections that you and Chris Clark establish for why Peter Sutcliffe looks like a good suspect for the murder of Judith Roberts?
I don't think it can ever be stressed enough that when you look at Peter Sutcliffe and his offending history and his MO, that he is an opportunist, first and foremost. And he is someone who would regularly change his MO, often enough that it would confuse the police.
A truly terrifying kind of killer. I mean, he's such a chameleon.
Yes. Yes, he is. And he's just so quick to react to everything that's going on, that it is the main reason why he stays undetected for so long, because he is changing his MO. He is operating in, very similar areas, but he is, broadening that horizon in terms of where he's operating. And so when Chris Clark and I sat down and looked at Judith's case, we looked at, could Peter Sutcliffe have been responsible for this? And the reason that we wanted to look at this was because when you read the Byford report, they conclude that, so the quote is, "It is my firm conclusion that between 1969 and 1980, Sutcliffe was probably responsible for many attacks on unaccompanied women, not only in West Yorkshire and Manchester, but also in other parts of the country." That is the outcome of that report, that Peter Sutcliffe didn't just commit these 13 murders and 7 attempted murders. He had other victims out there. And again, in that same report, there is a mention of 13 other potential victims, which I might say has never been officially released, is still under lock and key to the British public.
That particular list is still under lock and key?
That particular list and also other parts of the report are under lock and key, despite campaigns that information should be made public, and even so many years later is still being denied.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. It does seem like with so much time gone past, it's the need to keep it sealed. It's hard to see how that you can make an argument for that at this point. Really, really interesting to think that his first conviction is 1975, right? For a case that happened in 1975. Is that correct? The first murder that he was on record for. Um, I,
Yes.
so the idea that that wouldn't actually be his first kill, like on the one hand, it seems like common sense. Like most of the time, if you're a serial killer, you're pretty good at what you do. So the idea that people wouldn't know what your first murder was, it actually that makes sense. But to think that this report would establish that they believe starting in 1969, I mean that's 6 years that he could be out killing and not have any convictions for. And so it really opens up, I'm sure, a lot of cases. And so why Judith Roberts? Why is this one, the subtitle to the book is The Mark of Peter Sutcliffe. So why does Judith have this mark?
So the most, or sorry, I should say, so when you look at Judith's injuries, the thing that stands out the most is that she had 18 fractures to her skull.
Mm.
And as I say, that is a vicious attack on a young child. And when you look at Peter Sutcliffe's other victims and the other women who were attacked by him, they have similar injuries. They were attacked with hammers. They were attacked with screwdrivers.
Oh,
You know, their bodies were posed in a particular way. They had, in some cases, Peter Sutcliffe had ejaculated near their bodies. So very, very unsavory stuff. And when you look at Judith, when you look at where she's living, so her locale, when you look at the injuries, when you find out that Peter Sutcliffe at that time was making journeys between West Yorkshire and down to London frequently, and that Staffordshire and where Judith was killed is right along that route of where he would have been traveling,
oh,
you start to go, well, hang on a second. And
yeah.
the fact that the police had no other suspects. There was one mention in a particular news report that I found of a farmer's son, but he was then proven to have an alibi. So I kind of don't, you know, he gets discounted very, very quickly. But the police have really no other suspects. And that is also very, very similar to a lot of the attacks that happen, and Chris Clark makes mention of them in his book with Tim Tate, of other attacks where it seems like Peter Sutcliffe was involved because of the MO, the injuries, the body placement, the areas in which they were found. It builds a bigger picture of someone who is already incredibly vicious and had so little regard for human life. And I think as well, one of the things I was really keen to show, because I, in my research, spoke to a police officer who worked in Staffordshire at the time, and he kind of, you know, scoffed a little bit when I mentioned Judith Roberts and Judith's case. And he said to me, you know, there's no way that Peter Sutcliffe could be responsible because Peter Sutcliffe only targeted adults. He only targeted people in a particular area, and he only operated at night. And through researching this book and researching Peter Sutcliffe, all three of those caveats are completely inaccurate. I mean, Peter Sutcliffe in 1975, so around the time that we know for definite that he is offending, he attacks a 14-year-old girl as she's walking home with her sister. Her sister's gone off into the distance, walked home, and Peter Sutcliffe walks alongside her. He engages in conversation with her at length, and he attacks her very close to her home. And she luckily survives, and it is just down to luck. He is disturbed by somebody who comes by the area, and this young woman is able to run home or run to the nearest house and get help, but she is only 14 at that time. Another victim in 1977 is Jane MacDonald. Jane was only 16, and she was killed coming home from a night out as well. And I don't think a lot of people maybe think too much about this, but in 1976, Peter Sutcliffe attacks a woman named Marcella Claxton, who was 4 months pregnant, and she lost the baby due to the trauma that she experienced. And while that wasn't a direct attack on her unborn child, he very clearly has no regard for life, no matter the age. And I think that is something that we try and highlight in the book. Another victim is Teresa Sykes. Again, she is a survivor, but she is attacked in 1980. She's only 16 years old. And when you see the pictures of these women, you see how young they look. And I mean, at 16, 17, 18, you think you are so grown up and you think you know the world and you've got all these street smarts. But I think as you get older and you look at that age, you think you are a baby.
Yes.
You are such a precious, sweet child.
Yes.
And so I, from looking at Peter Sutcliffe's offending, think that he had no regard for life, whether the victim was 42 or 14.
It's really haunting. In the story that you told about him walking this girl after, her sister went around the corner and keeping her company, and how charming he had been, and it was giving me Ted Bundy vibes, Tanita. Yeah. I was thinking just the idea that he seemed to almost enjoy the hunt, and the idea that these women, at least some of them, trusted him, believed that he was safe, let their guard down, for a moment or for many minutes, and had no idea that they were in the presence of a true menace. And I really thank you for writing this book and for making these connections. A lot of people don't recognize all of the research and work and hours that go into doing this kind of data journalism, where you make connections across decades and jurisdictions, and it's no small feat what you and Chris Clark have done, Tanita. So I think, hats off to you.
Thank you so much. And I think for us, it was just making sure that Judith didn't get lost in this narrative. And for us, it's not so much about Peter Sutcliffe. It's about a young girl whose crime never got officially solved. And I do say in the book, because there's lots of ways you can interpret the data, and there's lots of ways you can look at it and make arguments on both sides. But I make the really strong argument that at some point there does need to be an official answer as to who is responsible for Judith. And while Chris and I have done our research and we believe that Peter Sutcliffe is the person who committed this crime, and as long as we keep talking about Judith, keep her memory alive, then hopefully one day there is some true justice for her, because I feel like that's the thing that her and her family just never got, regardless of how much we talk about who it might be or who it could be. Actually, there is still a family out there who deserve justice for losing their loved one.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again for joining me today on Justice Pending. If listeners want to connect with you, do you want to tell them where they can find you online, or any new project you're working on that you feel comfortable sharing? However you want to take that.
Yeah, absolutely. If people want to connect online, I am on Instagram. It is Tanita_Matthews. And I love being able to connect with people and hear their thoughts on the book, or hear their thoughts on a particular case that they have come across and it has resonated with them. So that is a good place to find me. And as far as other projects are going, I mean, I work in documentaries. That is my full-time job as a freelancer. So I'm working on various things at the moment, but in the meantime, I've got a couple of other books that I'd like to write and get out. But I mean, this one took 5 years from start to finish. And so I think I needed a bit of a breather to kind of collect myself. But there's a couple of other ideas and a couple of other cases, both unsolved cases, which I'd like to bring some more attention to. And so fingers crossed, in a few more years, there'll be a couple of other books alongside talking about some other lesser known unsolved cases.
Great. Well, we will keep our eye on you, Tanita. Thank you so much for joining me, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Claire.
Justice Pending is recorded in Dallas, Texas for Rebel Studios. It's hosted by me, Claire Sanamaw, and Susan Passoni. Our theme music is Bending Truth, licensed at premiumbeat.com. We appreciate all listener feedback. Leave a review wherever you're listening right now, and we might read it on the air. Thanks for joining us.
This has been a Rogue Media Network production.